Hi everyone, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 14 in your textbook. There's lots of information in this chapter about persuasion, and I'm only giving you a brief overview, so make sure you read it. Okay, let's talk about persuasive speaking. Humans have been persuading each other ever since the dawn of time. Even ancient humans had to persuade each other to do things a particular way for the benefit and survival of the group. As we became more civilized, we began to use techniques outlined by Aristotle and the Greek philosophers to develop rhetoric, or the art of persuasion in public speaking, as you learned in Chapter 1. When we speak persuasively, we attempt to reinforce, modify, or change the beliefs, attitudes, opinions, values, and even the behaviors of our listeners. We do this through the use of language, images, and other forms of communication. When you persuade, you show the audience why your claims are true and help them decide for themselves. Ethical persuasion implies choice, and it's not coercion, bullying, or brainwashing. Forcing or compelling people to think a certain way through social pressure, threat, or intimidation is not persuasion. A free society is founded on the rights of people to choose their own course of action, as long as it doesn't harm others. Persuasion is also honest. It's not misleading or manipulative. It doesn't use dishonest tactics to deceive people. You should never seek to withhold crucial evidence, present inaccurate information, or misrepresent research in order to further your cause. If you believe that you can use any means to achieve your end, you're not an ethical speaker, and you don't belong in my class. When you persuade, you go beyond informative speaking and become an advocate for a specific viewpoint. You voice a clear position on the topic and seek to show others that they should hold that position as well. There are a few different ways you can go with persuasive speeches. You can do what's called practical persuasion, where you attempt to persuade the audience to do things that would be of some personal benefit to them, like exercise more or improve their eating habits or use social media less. Those would really be good topics for the final speech of the semester, the motivated sequence speech. But for your upcoming persuasive speech, you'll be focusing on issue-based persuasive topics, which are topics that impact our society more widely. As I said, issue-based persuasion deals with topics that have serious consequences for society. These speeches are based on questions that deal with fact, value, and policy. A question of fact asks whether something is true or false. A question of value asks for a subjective value of something's worth. And a question of policy asks what specific course of action should be taken. Your upcoming persuasive speech will be based on a question of policy. But let's look at how each type of question leads to a persuasive speech. Questions of fact revolve around whether something is or is not the case. If you're arguing a question of fact, you take a position that something did or did not occur, or that one event did or did not cause another. In a trial, the prosecution tries to prove that the defendant did do something illegal, while the defense attorney attempts to persuade the jury that the defendant did not commit the crime. In your case, you must be able to present sound, credible evidence that the claims you're making are true. The book gives several good examples of speeches based on questions of fact. This working outline example about the causes of autism has a topical organizational pattern. The specific purpose is to convince the audience that the causes of autism are still unknown. The thesis is that current theories of autism still haven't identified its cause. Then each main point deals with a different theory, discussing what it is and why it doesn't really answer the question of what causes autism. Questions of value evaluate the worth, significance, quality, or condition of something and ask the audience to believe that evaluation. These are qualitative, subjective judgments and can't necessarily ever be proven true or false. You're not trying to prove something is true. You're addressing individual opinions and maybe even cultural beliefs. In this kind of speech, you set a standard by which something should be judged and ask the audience to buy into that standard. Most persuasive speeches based on questions of value use chronological, spatial, or topical organizational patterns. In the example shown here, the speaker's trying to persuade the audience that fully electric cars are superior to other types of cars. They use a chronological or historical structure to show how cars have developed over time and show that electric cars will eventually make other vehicles obsolete. Finally, questions of policy deal with ways to fix problems. The key to recognizing a policy speech is that somewhere in the thesis you can find the word should. This word signifies some kind of action, which is at the heart of a policy speech. In this kind of speech, you explain to the audience that a problem exists and advocate for a particular solution to that problem. It may be something you just want the audience to agree with is the best solution, or you may actually want the audience to do something about it. It totally depends on what your topic and specific purpose is. The best organizational patterns for policy speeches are problem solution, which usually has two main points, one addressing the problem and one advocating for a solution. Now, sometimes a problem solution speech might have more than 2 points as shown in the textbook, but I prefer that you try to organize it as 2 main points like the example shown here. The first main point talks about the problems associated with 9-month schools, and the second main point sets out the solution as a 12-month school calendar. The other types are problem cause solution, which has 3 main points. You guessed it, one discussing the problem, one talking about the main cause or causes of the problem, and one addressing the solution. Then there are Monroe's motivated sequence speeches, and that's the 5-step organizational pattern that's specifically designed for speeches where you want the audience to take some kind of action. There's a good discussion of motivated sequence in the textbook, so I won't go into it now. Just know that if you choose this for your final speech, there's a module at the end that shows how to put one of these speeches together. For your upcoming persuasive speech, you will very likely be doing either a problem solution or a problem cause solution speech. Back in Chapter 5, we discussed how to analyze an audience and adapt your speech to them. In persuasion, you definitely need to understand your audience well enough to know who they are so that you can make your arguments as effective as possible. In general, when you're trying to convince people of something, you'll find that they fall into one of these 5 groups. They may be negative, which means they understand your topic but hold a negative opinion of your position on it. They may be positive, which means they understand the topic and are already on your side. Lots of times when you're dealing with controversial issues, you'll find you have a divided audience, where some people hold a negative view while others have a positive view. Then, depending on the topic, you might have uninformed audience members who didn't even realize that this problem exists, and so they don't have an opinion about it. Finally, there may be apathetic audience members who generally know about a topic but think that it doesn't affect them, so why should they think about it? Let's look at strategies for each kind of audience. Just the label hostile audience sounds scary. I mean, all you have to do is look at any political post on Facebook to see the absolute venom people express for those who disagree with them. Let me put your mind at ease and tell you that doesn't happen in my class. In here, we speak ethically. We have respect for people who hold other viewpoints, even if we don't agree. Most of the time, people think they have good reasons for believing certain things. Those beliefs may be based on misunderstandings, biases, being exposed to incorrect information, or many other reasons. But to simply negate someone's deeply held beliefs is not going to convince them of anything. It'll probably make them dig their heels in deeper. So what can you do if you know that at least some members of your audience hold the opposite opinion from you? Well, the most important thing here is your credibility. You need to make sure you know your topic very well, not just your side, but understand why people believe the opposite of what you believe. If the audience can see that you're knowledgeable about the topic and the arguments on each side, they might be more willing to listen to you. And you also need to establish common ground with your hostile audience members. Find the things that you both believe in and mention those. For instance, if you're advocating for a tuition increase, well, it's very likely that your audience won't think that's a good thing. But if you say that you, along with most people in the room, are receiving financial aid and the amount of grant funding rises when tuition does, or that the cost of things that all students want, like a parking garage, or higher quality instructors, or more sections of classes that you need to graduate, will be paid for by the tuition increase, then you're creating common ground, talking about things that you and the audience can both agree upon are good things, which leads us to visualizing the topic positively. Couch your ideas in positive rather than negative terms. And of course, you need to address the audience's concerns. No one likes to change their ideas so drastically without considering all aspects of that change. But in the end, keep your expectations reasonable. Practically no one changes their mind on the basis of one speech. But if you do a really good job, they just might decide that, although they still disagree with you, that was a pretty good speech. I'd call that a success. When it comes to positive or sympathetic audiences who already agree with your thesis, you might think you don't even have to bother with them because they're already on your side. But you'd be wrong. Think about this. Who is the preacher talking to in church on Sunday? People who don't agree with her, or people who do? Right, she's preaching to the choir, as it were, and she doesn't just slack off, does she? Her sermon is engaging and interesting, with vivid language and relatable stories. And because the audience already agrees with her, she can actually ask them to do things regarding the topic. So just because people agree with you is no reason to slack off. Many audiences you will face will be divided on your thesis. Some will agree and some will disagree. It's important that you don't go in thinking that everyone's hostile or sympathetic. Acknowledge that there are differing viewpoints and each needs to be respected. Again, your credibility here is important, as is the technique of establishing common ground. Then look at the persuasive strategies for both hostile and sympathetic audiences and decide which of them is going to work best with your particular audience. There may also be people in your audience, or perhaps an entire audience, who are uninformed about your topic and thesis. Because they really haven't ever thought about the topic, you actually have a chance to move them in the direction of your thesis. But you have to make the topic relevant to them. Show them that even though they don't know much about it, it's really in their best interest to find out about it. And definitely demonstrate expertise on the topic. If they can see that you know your stuff, they'll be more likely to trust you. Don't try to ignore the opposition, though. You need to be fair in your treatment. Repetition of key ideas, providing different types of supporting material that all basically support your points is key. And be subtle. Don't be overly dramatic or passionate. That can actually push an uninformed audience away from your thesis. Finally, apathetic audiences have at least some knowledge of the topic. They just don't care about it enough to have an opinion. They believe the topic doesn't affect them, so they ignore anything associated with it. Your goal with these kinds of audience members is to give them a reason to care. Get their attention in an interesting way and relate the topic to their lives. If you're energetic and dynamic, your enthusiasm will pull them along. Taking a one-sided approach doesn't mean you ignore other sides of the issue, but that you focus mainly on your side. And while presentation media is always important, it can be particularly influential to show a video or some images to an apathetic audience to help them relate even more to the topic. I'm going to talk a little more about ethics because it's so important. We're living through a unique period of history, one in which much of the persuasive language in our society seems to be completely devoid of ethics. In attempting to win support for their agendas, various entities and people have resorted to manipulation, coercion, threats, inconsistencies, and outright falsehoods. These tactics may be more and more common, but that does not make them acceptable, and it will not be allowed in my classroom. Your strong and deep-rooted beliefs may be very important to you, but they are not so important that you would compromise your ethics in order to get us to believe you. The National Communication Association has standards for ethical communication that state, "We condemn communication that degrades individuals and humanity through distortion, intimidation, coercion, and violence, and through the expression of intolerance and hatred. So no, you don't get to try to convince us that your dislike for a group of people different from you in some way is justified. You are certainly free to hate whoever you want, but you're not free in my class to give a speech about how that's the way we should all feel. And no, that's not infringing on your freedom of speech. As the instructor of this class, it is my prerogative to approve all speech topics, and I would never approve of something like that. Also, ethical speakers do not attempt to deceive or manipulate the audience. Instead, they present their information and arguments truthfully, accurately, and honestly. So you have a responsibility to make sure you're creating the best arguments using the best and most accurate information, supporting material and evidence that you can find, and presenting it to us accurately. And finally, the National Communication Association endorses freedom of expression, diversity of perspective, and tolerance of dissent. Now, what that means is that as an audience member, you might hear things in this class with which you disagree. I don't expect you to just agree with everything you hear. I expect you, however, to listen carefully when you hear a claim that you don't agree with, and rather than just angrily sit there and think about why that speaker's wrong, listen to their evidence and arguments to see if you can figure out why they believe the way they do. You may still end up disagreeing, but you'll find that understanding their motives and underlying reasons makes you a more tolerant individual. This is the end of the lecture for Chapter 14. Now you're ready to go to MindTap.